And because my computer's been spazzing out on me all day, I'm not in the right headspace to teach. So let me calm down and reorient my brain where it needs to be. Okay, so here's my first question. What does monotheism mean? Anybody want to take a guess? Not quite. Go ahead. Belief in one God. That is a very good definition. So then, if that's what monotheism is, polytheism. Believe in multiple gods. Henotheism?
All gods?
That's not a bad guess, actually.
No gods.
That would be atheism, which actually doesn't. I didn't even think about it. That would have made sense. Henotheism, a less common word. What about monolatry? Yeah, these are less common words. Monotheism and polytheism, the belief in one God or the belief in multiple gods, are typically the two that we stick with in common language. To get started with here, I wanted to actually make sure that you knew these terms because we're going to call them into question today based on ancient language. And we're going to have to know what a henotheist is and possibly what a monolatry is, because those are very close and similar in terms. A henotheistic approach is when you believe in multiple gods, but you only worship one God out of those multiple gods. So it's part polytheism because you believe in multiple gods, but it's part monotheism because you only worship one God. So that term gets called henotheism. Oftentimes, the ancient Israelites in the Bible are referred to not as monotheists strictly, but as henotheists, because they seem to, in a lot of people's minds, believe in a lot of different gods. And you'll see why, hopefully, as we go through some scripture here this morning. By the way, pull out your Bibles and turn to Psalm 82. It'll take us a while to get there, but you can go ahead and start getting there while I'm defining this. Monolatry is the belief in multiple gods, but you have kind of a supreme God in a pantheon. By that I mean something akin to what goes on in Ephesus in the New Testament. Ephesus' patron god, or in this case goddess, was Artemis. She was referred to in Ephesus as Artemis of the Ephesians. She was the patron god. They believed in all the other gods. They worshipped all the other gods because they weren't trying to offend those gods, but they had a patron god. So worshiping multiple gods, but having a patron deity out of all the pantheon is more along the lines of monolatry, like Monopoly. When one god or one person playing Monopoly gets all the money. In monolatry, one god out of all the gods gets the attention from a select group of people. But one god out of the Roman pantheon became the patron god of one city. That's a monolatrous structure. Any questions on those terms? I hope by the time we're done today that we will come back to those terms and you will understand why I started with them. But I'm glad you knew what monotheism and polytheism were. Now you know a little bit about henotheism and monolatry. Should we impose our modern words and their definitions back on to ancient texts? Is it even right to do that? Because I think what I hope to prove to you out of some scripture and some basic definitions of Hebrew terms is that depending on how you define what a god was, the ancient Hebrews would have been considered polytheists, and they would have considered you a polytheist. Except that you probably don't worship multiple gods, so maybe you're actually more of a henotheist. Or maybe you're more of a monolatrist instead of a strictly defined monotheist. Depending on what you define as a god, you probably believe in more than one god in the biblical sense. So maybe we shouldn't take these modern definitions, impose them back on ancient storytellers, and reject what their definition of a god actually was. So that's basically what I've written here. What if I told you that depending on how these modern words get defined, you could argue that the Bible teaches the existence of more than one God? but not the worship of more than one God. But it depends on what you mean when you say God. Okay, so here's what we're discussing this morning. Throughout the ancient world generally, and the Bible specifically, any and all beings that reside in the non-physical world, which I will refer to as the celestial world or the celestial realm, any being like that could be referred to as a god. But the Bible does teach that one God is unique and set apart from all the others. That God's name is Yahweh, or he calls himself Yahweh. And Yahweh is holy and completely different from all other beings in heaven, the celestial realm, or on earth, the human realm. Let's talk about that. All right. Let's watch this video. This is two Bible Project videos put together. I've edited them together for time. It's about 6 minutes long.
If you pick up the Bible, you don't have to read far before you meet the main character, God.
Yeah, he appears in the Bible's first sentence. And then later on page 1, you meet the humans.
And there you have it. The two main players in the Bible, God and humans on the stage of our world.
Well, not quite. In the Bible, there's actually a way bigger cast of characters than just humans and God.
Like who?
I mean the figures called the Elohim in the Hebrew scriptures. Angels, the Satan, demons, they're all over the story.
Oh, right. Spiritual beings. To be honest, I've never really known what to do with them. It's all kind of weird.
And unfortunately, almost all of our modern conceptions about these beings are based on serious misunderstandings.
All right, so let's talk about spiritual beings in the story of the Bible.
So first thing we have to do is reorient ourselves to how the ancient biblical authors saw the world. On pages 1 and 2 of Genesis, God brings order to a watery wilderness, separating the skies above from the land below.
Right, this is Earth, where we live, and then there's the heavens high above, which they saw as God's domain.
But in the Bible, these spaces are not separate. They overlap. And in fact, the Garden of Eden is described throughout the Bible as a high mountain garden where heaven and earth are one.
Cool.
So that's the world. Now it needs some creatures. God first creates and appoints the sun, moon, and stars to rule the day and night.
You mean the giant flaming gas balls in the sky?
Well, that's how you think about them. But the biblical authors, like all ancient people, saw them as heavenly creatures that are glorious, shining bright, and high above.
Which is strange. I don't think of stars as creatures.
Well, you don't. But for the biblical authors, the stars formed their categories for thinking and talking about a spiritual reality that exists alongside ours. And it's a different kind of reality, just like the sky is different from the land. And it's populated with creatures that have different kinds of bodies, shiny spiritual bodies.
Okay, so almost all ancient cultures thought of the stars as divine beings, including the ancient Israelites.
But the biblical authors make clear that these beings are not God. Rather, they're images of God. Their glory and high status is a reflection of the Creator's glory and status, and they exist to serve His purposes.
So the stars symbolize beings who are like God's heavenly staff team.
Right. Now let's go back, because after God appointed the heavenly host, He also appointed another type of creature.
The humans.
Yeah, in Hebrew they're called Adam, which sounds like the Hebrew word for dirt because that's what they're made of.
So glorious rulers above and hairy sapiens below.
But then comes the great twist. God tells the lowly humans that they are to rule all of creation. He invites them to rise above their dirty origins and share in God's glory as His partners.
So God wants to rule the world through humans and not the spiritual beings.
Exactly. This is how the poet of Psalm 8 understood the stories of Genesis. He looked up at the stars and says,
"What is humanity that you consider him? You made him lower than the spiritual beings, but crowned him with glory and divine majesty."
This is humanity's high calling, to rule creation in the love and power of God.
When most people think about the story of the Bible, they think of a story about God and humans.
But remember, we learned that there's a whole other cast of characters that appears throughout the Bible and plays a really important role.
Oh, right. Spiritual beings, angels, demons, and the like.
Right. And in the Bible, they inhabit the heavenly realm, which is parallel to our earthly reality and actually overlaps with it.
Now, all of these spiritual beings have their own unique characteristics.
But here's what's fascinating. The biblical authors have one word that can refer to all the inhabitants of the spiritual realm. In Old Testament Hebrew, the word is Elohim, and in New Testament Greek, it's Theos. But here's the thing. This word gets translated in lots of different ways depending on which being is referred to. Angels, gods with a lowercase g, or even God with a capital G.
Wait, so one word can refer to any of these beings?
Yeah, it's because Elohim is a category title. It can designate any spiritual being that belongs to the heavenly realm.
Okay, a title, not a name. Like the word mom.
Yeah, right. The word mom can refer to lots of really different kinds of people, but they all share in common the same role in a family. And then let's say a group of brothers and sisters are talking, and one says, hey, it's mom's birthday. They're using the title like it's a name.
But it would be clear that they're referring not to any mom, but their mom.
Yes, and the same goes for the biblical authors. They called their God Yahweh, which is the name revealed to Moses, but they also sometimes refer to him with the category title Elohim, using it like a name, because they all know who they're referring to.
Okay, but don't the biblical authors think that Yahweh's in a class of his own, not like any other?
They do, which is why they say things like Yahweh is the Elohim of Elohim. That is, the chief Elohim among all the others. Or they'll say, there's no Elohim beside Yahweh, meaning no other spiritual being compares to him because only he is the ruler and creator of all things.
Okay, I'm following, but I thought the Bible taught monotheism, which means there's just one God.
Well, the biblical authors are claiming that among all of the spiritual beings out there, only one is the source and creator of all things, including the Elohim. That's biblical monotheism, that one Elohim, Yahweh, is above all other Elohim, that is, the other spiritual beings.
So they gave you a bunch of terms there, and they're all legitimate terms for how you could talk about and discuss biblical ideas, especially about celestial beings. But why am I using the term celestial as opposed to spiritual or heavenly, which are more common and get thrown about regularly in churches? And that's kind of my answer. They're too common, they're too regular, and they're too unspecific. So there's lots of English words that could touch on some valid meaning of these ancient ideas and concepts in the Hebrew Bible, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, in the Greek New Testament. You know, you could call them all sorts of things. They get called gods. They get called divine beings. They get called angels. They get called spiritual beings, heavenly beings, sons of God. There's lots of different words that come up. I'm going to stick with the term celestial. Despite the fact that a lot of these terms are interchangeable, I want to avoid using words like spiritual or heavenly because they're too broad in their use. You hear them all the time and you don't know what they mean because nobody ever defines them. You say heavenly, you say spiritual, you could be talking about a dozen different things, and whoever's using the term never brings up what they mean. They talk about spiritual warfare, they talk about spiritual realities, and you don't know if they're talking about metaphorical things, just emotional things. If you're talking about a non-physical universe, they don't define their terms and they throw it all out there in the same words all the time with zero clarity and zero specificity. So I'm going to avoid using those terms as much as possible. I'm going to avoid using the term angels because the word angels, in the Old Testament at least, refers only to low-level spiritual beings, low-level celestial beings. Grant, sit up. I see your eyes falling asleep. You're too comfortable. Low-level celestial beings who pass back and forth delivering messages and performing a few specific tasks. That's it. Angels are not the most powerful beings in the celestial realms. They are the least powerful beings in the celestial realms. So they get the term messenger, which in Greek is angelos, which is angel. And it's a very broad term in Greek that misidentifies the distinctions in Hebrew. So the thing is, celestial is my own chosen word for the broad foreign ideas of the Bible. Okay? It's foreign enough in our English thinking that we can apply some specific meaning to it and correct the mistakes of people just throwing out religious jargon. Oh, it's spiritual. Oh, it's heavenly. Whatever that means, I don't really know, so I'm not going to clarify. Just take my word for it. Well, I am going to attempt to clarify. This is how I'm doing it. I am referring to what's popularly referred to as heaven. I'm just not going to call it that for good reason. You think you think of specific things, whether you know it or not, when you think of the term heaven. But I don't want you to attach that meaning to it until you understand what the scripture actually says about heaven. So I'm going to use a foreign term to take you out of your comfort zone in thinking and try to get you to apply some different meaning when you think of heaven. So I'm going to call it the celestial realm. See, a part of this is because there is hierarchy in heaven. There is order to the celestial world as much as there's order on earth. And yes, there are beings called angels, angelic beings. And if you refer to all celestial beings as angels, you will miss the order in heaven, that angels are on the bottom. The sons of God and the cherubim and the seraphim are on the top, and there's military structure in between all of that. So in order for you to eventually get that as we walk through it these next few weeks, I'm going to use the term celestial. I just prefer the term celestial. I will primarily use it to refer to any being that inhabits the non-physical world. It is my chosen word for translating and communicating the idea of the Hebrew and Greek broad terms for gods. Hebrew Elohim and Greek Theos. That's what the video just told us, right? So I'm just putting an English word to an ancient idea, trying to be foreign and trying to clarify. Any questions? All right, so let's orient ourselves to the ancients here. A divine being or a god in the ancient world is not typically what we would define a god by our modern English words. And this causes all sorts of problems and misreadings of the Bible. So whether you're in the Old Testament, whether you're in the New Testament, the ancients thought of any being at all that lived and resided in the celestial world, the non-physical universe where God lives alongside the rest of the celestial beings, that being was a god. That being was in Hebrew an Elohim. In Greek, a Theos. It didn't matter how powerful it was, didn't matter where it was on the ranking in the celestial realm. They would just label it a god. A god, in the broad sense, any being of the non-physical world, and therefore immortal, because it doesn't have a physical body. So how do you attack it and kill it? You can't. That's all immortality really was in the ancient world. So now, there are 6 different groups in the Old Testament that are referred to as Elohim. One, you could be referring to Yahweh, the one that we actually just refer to as God. He's the creator and he's the king of all other Elohim and celestial beings. And I've given you 2 scriptures up there. One we've already looked at because we've already been through Genesis 2. But God's called Elohim thousands of times in the Old Testament. I mean, literally over 2,000 times. But he's not the only one. The celestial members of his family are also referred to as Elohim. And there you see Psalm 82 is mentioned, and we're going to get into that verse here in a moment. The gods and goddesses of other nations are referred to as Elohim. Demons are referred to as Elohim. We'll look at this verse in Deuteronomy 32:17 after we look at Psalm 82. And then we'll look at 1 Samuel 28:13, where Samuel, having died, is referred to as an Elohim. Why? Because he's a spirit, right? He's passed on to the non-physical world. So he has become a non-physical being, or an Elohim, or a god, or a celestial being, or whatever. But he's even lower in the rankings than the angels. And then there's just, the angels in general, the messengers of God. There's too many verses to pick from, so I didn't even bother putting a handful of scriptures up there. Because if anybody's referred to an Elohim, it's the Malachim, the Hebrew word for angels. All right, a couple more things before we start looking. All right, never mind. Let's start looking at these verses. Deuteronomy 32, 15 through 17. So this is a little bit more than just verse 17, but I want you to see it. So this is Moses standing on the border of the people going into Canaan, and he can't go in. So he's giving them last-minute instructions and last-minute details and telling their story and everything that they've lived through again. And he's also looking to the future. And in verse 15, here you see every time the word God is used and it's referring to God singular, I put it in capital. Every time God's plural is actually used, I put it in lowercase. And then it shows up multiple times in the same sentence. They abandoned the God who made them and rejected the rock, their Savior. They made him jealous with their foreign gods, and they angered him with their detestable idols. They sacrificed to false gods, demons, which are not Elohim, God. Elohim, gods they had not known. Elohim, gods they had not, that had recently appeared. Elohim, gods that your ancestors do not fear. So you can see there's no change to the spelling, but you don't know by the spelling, are you talking about God or are you talking about gods plural? Because the spelling is always plural. And then this word shadim, the word for demons, only shows up 3 times in the Old Testament. I think 2 of them are in this chapter. False gods, shadim, which are not gods, Elohim. So you can start to see from that a lot of different beings can be referred to as Elohim, and including dead Samuel. Samuel's died. Saul is a very bad king, and Saul needs Samuel's help. So he goes and he finds a witch to say, I need you to perform an exorcism and bring up the prophet Samuel. She says, oh, I can't do that. Saul would find me and kill me because he's in disguise. She doesn't know it's Saul yet. And she said, don't worry about it. Saul won't find you. Saul won't kill you. Just go ahead and do it. The woman asked, whom shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel, he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So she freaks out. She wasn't actually expecting to bring up a dead person. She was expecting to trick the guy out of some money like a con artist. The king said, don't be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said, I see a ghostly figure. I'm using the NIV translation here. A ghostly figure, Hebrew, Elohim, coming up out of the earth. It's like I see a spirit, a celestial thing. I see something from the other world coming up out of the earth here. And Saul says, yep, that's him. Let me talk to him. And Samuel says, you're going to die tomorrow along with your sons. So heads up there. All right. So the video did a good job encapsulating this ancient idea. There are 2 worlds in the mind of the ancients. At least 2, maybe more. They're called worlds. I'll sometimes refer to them as realms, but they're basically their heaven and their earth, right? Man, or Adam, is created out of the Adamah, the ground, the land, the earth, whatever the term is. We've already seen that in Genesis 2. However, despite the fact that humans live on the land, the material from which they were created, we look up and we see another world, one that's entirely unlike the world that we're living on and inhabiting. We call this, or I will call it, the celestial world, the heavenly world, the world above, the skies, something like that. And it's where the sun and the moon and the stars live and fill that world, that realm. It is a world that humans do not live in and one they cannot get to, not on their own. This is the place where all of these celestial beings reside. Or I should say, where they're supposed to reside. So this is how humans start to think about and describe beings that live forever. Gods. Beings that are going to be there all your lifetime, and when you die and you have kids, it's going to be there your kids' entire lifetime, and when they die and they have kids, it's going to be there for their entire lifetimes. Why? Because they were there for your parents' entire lifetimes, your grandparents' entire lifetimes, going back for all of recorded history. These immortal beings, the sun, moon, and stars, have always been there. And that becomes their category for looking up and saying, these things are gods because they don't die. They're always around generation to generation. Mortal man dies here on the earth, but these beings do not. These are image bearers of God in the celestial realm. This is more of a biblical idea than just an ancient idea. You are not the only image bearers of God in existence. You're just the image bearers of God on the land, on the earth. In the heavens, the celestial beings are God's image bearers. Grant, sit up. Your eyes are dripping closed. I don't want it. Oh, wake up. They are not God, singular, but they do image him. Okay? They bear his glory, his status, to the same way that we do. They carry on his purposes. Anything that he wants done, he sends these beings out to do. Sound familiar? It's exactly the same things that we've covered about humanity in Genesis 1 and 2. It's just not a physical universe they're doing this in. And some of them can pass between the non-physical celestial world and our physical universe. And they do that when God tells them to. And they also rebel and do it when God tells them not to. All right, so the video did a good job pointing this out. Elohim is a category title, as much as a proper name sometimes. It can refer to any and all beings that live and reside in the celestial realm. In Israel, it is also used as a title or a name for Israel's one God, Elohim. So they gave you the example of mom. A group of people are using the title category of mom, but they know who you're talking to. If you were using different words like pastor, well, maybe you're talking about me or Josh or Jimmy. And you could just as easily identify which one you're talking about, depending on where you're at and who you're discussing with. And you may not actually have to say the proper name, Pastor Chuck, Pastor Josh, or Pastor Jimmy, and still they would have no problem identifying who you're talking about. Captain, military titles, rank. You refer to them by a title or by a rank or something. They know who you're talking about. And the term Elohim can be used that way. Wait, let me go back. Nope, never mind. Elohim, as I've already mentioned, is always spelled in the plural. El is singular. Elohim is always plural. So why wouldn't they just say El if they're talking about God, and Elohim if they're talking about other celestial beings? And sometimes they do. But a lot of the times they just use Elohim. And this is going to get us into Psalm 82 here in just a brief moment. You have to pair it with a singular verb or an adjective or something to make the noun Elohim to be read as singular. So it could be read as God, singular, or God's plural, just like the English word sheep. Sheep has one spelling, S-H-E-E-P, sheep. You have to pair it with is or are to determine whether the term is singular or plural. It's not the spelling, it's the surrounding words. This is called grammar. The sheep is lost is singular or plural? So one sheep. The sheep are lost. How many sheep? Yeah, at least one, at least two, right? Maybe more. So you could be talking about a lot of different sheep. There's no change to the spelling, but the grammar changes in it. Words like this exist all the time in English. And you know them, but you know them so well you overlook them. The thing is, they exist that same way in all languages, and people are used to just overlooking them in Hebrew because they automatically assume they know what Elohim means, but they don't. And this is how they get to defining monotheism and polytheism incorrectly, because they're coming to the rules of grammar and syntax in Hebrew and assuming that they know the rules because of what exists in their language in English, and then they make all the same rules. This rule applies in Hebrew. You don't change the spelling, you just connect it with other rules to determine if it's singular or plural. Any questions on that? You get that? I know grammar is sometimes boring, spelling is boring, but it's going to help you a lot to be able to narrow down such a simple concept. All right, good. I'm glad you get that. Yay. Let's look at Psalm 82. Let's read this psalm. Tell you what. Let's share the wealth. By wealth, I mean Mike. It's only 8 verses. Zane, I want you to read the first 4 verses. We got some other verses, so we'll just go around here. So Psalm 82, 4 verses, and then as we start getting into other verses that I have up here, we'll move around. Here you go, Zane.
Psalm 82. It's hard to see from this angle.
Yeah. Feel free to move wherever you can see. No big deal.
God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. What do I stop?
Keep going. One more. One more verse.
Rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked.
Pass it along. Oh, go ahead.
The gods know nothing, they understand nothing. They walk about in darkness, all the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are you inherit.
Thank you. All right. We've got some more verses coming, but so I'm just going to hold this up and talk into this for the moment. Now let me show you a different way to look and read this. Elohim presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the Elohim. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Who's talking? This Elohim. Who's he talking to? These Elohim. Singular and plural. But the spelling's exactly the same. And then God says, the one Elohim says to the other Elohim, the Elohim know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness and all the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are Elohim. You are sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals. Oof. You will fall like every other ruler. Rise up, O Elohim. Judge the earth. And all the nations will be your inheritance. So, the way that you know this is a singular God is because this verb here, presides, or sometimes sits, is actually in the singular. Oh, I didn't put this on the slides. Okay, so let me go back. Yeah, so presides or sits in the great assembly, the assembly of the gods. And you see here, to go back, this is the NIV, they put the gods in quotations. That's really dumb of the NIV to do because they're calling into question the existence of the gods. Celestial beings exist, and some of them rebel against God. These are the ones he's calling to account and judging in this assembly. That's what Psalm 82 is. The fact that the NIV is like, oh, well, the gods. He's like, oh, they're just the made-up idols of the pagans. No, these are the celestial beings, the sons of God that God made and that rebelled against him. And so you can see they can move all about in their poetic language, calling God and the gods by the same word poetically, making no distinction, but they know how to read their language. They know how to make the point, and they don't miss the point. The one God, their God, they don't have to call him Yahweh. They know who he is. He's the God of gods, the Elohim of Elohim, the one Elohim above all the other Elohim. Their grammar here points it out, and the context of saying that one of them is going to inherit the entire earth and take it away from all the other Elohim tells you which Elohim is it? Yahweh. They have the entire Old Testament to tell them this. You have thousands of verses that go around making this point in the Old Testament alone. Let's look at some other verses. All right, starting with Reagan. Just read till right here and then pass it along. And Talon, you can read down the second part. All right?
Listen to me, you descendants of Jacob, all the remnant of my people, you whom I have upheld since your birth, and have carried since your birth, even to your old age and gray hairs. I am he who will sustain you. I have made you and will carry you. I will sustain you and I will rescue you. With whom will you compare me or count me equal? To whom will you liken me that we may be compared?
Some pour out gold from their bags and weigh out silver on the scales. They hire a goldsmith to make it into a god, and they bow down and worship it. They lift it to their shoulders and carry it. They set it up in its place, and there it stands from That spot it cannot move. Even though someone cries out to it, it cannot answer, it cannot save them from their troubles. Is that all?
Go ahead and pass it along. And, Ashley, just read verses 8 and 9, please, at the bottom.
Remember this, keep it in mind, take it to heart, you rebels. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me.
All right, next one.
Our Redeemer, the Lord Almighty, is his name, is the Holy One of Israel. You said, I am forever the eternal Queen, but you do not consider these things or reflect on what might happen. Do you even keep going?
You can pass it along right there. Logan, verses 8 and 9, please.
Now listen, you lover of pleasure, lounging in your security and saying to yourself, I am, and there is none besides me. I will never be a widow, my bad, or suffer the loss of children. You said 9 too, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. Both of these will overtake you in a moment on a single day. Loss of children and widowhood, they will come upon you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries and all your potential spells.
Grant, just verse 10, please.
You have trusted in your wickedness and have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and knowledge mislead you. And when you say to yourself, I am, and there is no one besides me.
Okay, I got one more verse, but I'm going to read it myself. This last statement in Isaiah, when you say, I am, and there's no one beside me, this is Babylon boasting that they're so great, they're so powerful, and they're so incomparable that they're never going to fail and they're never going to die. And God, Yahweh, says, you're going to fail and you're going to die. You do not take for yourself what belongs to me only. This recognition and this glory that you're giving to yourself, that's mine. That's my status. And you're going to fail. They're not the only ones who made this boast. Zephaniah, a very good prophet, but only talked about in a very specific number of ways, he speaks about Nineveh in 3 chapters in his book. And he says this in 2:15. This is the city of revelry that lived in safety. She said to herself, I am the one, and there is none beside me. What a ruin she has become, a lair for wild beasts, and who passes by her and scoffs and shake their fists. Now, there's no God beside God, but he calls them all gods. What is he talking about? Babylon says there's no city beside me. Nineveh says there's no city beside me. I am the greatest. I am the best. What are they saying? Are they saying that there's no other cities on the face of the planet? Is God saying that there's no other such thing as a celestial being because he's the only celestial being? He's in it. Yeah, exactly. But it's hard to explain, but the ancients understood this. Okay, so you're talking about, yes, Babylon is the capital of the Babylonian Empire. Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrian Empire before Babylon took over. The question becomes, if God alone exists, how can he call other beings gods? How can he, in Psalm 82, refer to them as gods?
Because there's like a lower sector of people that consider.
Good. So there's other cities, but Babylon is boasting that they're the best, they're the most powerful. It's not a statement that says, oh, we're the only city in existence. It's like if a church says, well, our church is the only church. Our church is the real church. You know? Come on, man. If you don't come to our church, you can't meet with God. We are the church. You know? That boast and that level of arrogance is what's encapsulated when you said, we are such a great city, Babylon. All of our gods protect us. They fight for us. We're never going to lose a battle. We're never going to fight. We are an eternal dynasty, an eternal empire. Yeah, you wish. Yeah, that's exactly what God is pointing out to them, because he says, I alone am king of an eternal empire. I alone am the God you are boasting to be. I alone possess this status. I alone am in a class of my own. Other beings exist, but they are not worth your time and your attention. That's what we're getting at here. The claims made by Nineveh, later Babylon, is that they are incomparable in strength and glory. No other cities can compare to them. They are unlike the other cities, greater than all the other peoples. They will make They are making boast that they are greater than they really are. And when God claims, I am, and there are no others, I am God and there is none like me, he's making the statement that he is the true one that the pagans are boasting about being. Saying, you're wrong, that's my status, not yours. No humans and none of the gods, none of the other Elohim or celestial beings can compare to Yahweh. They exist, they're just not as good as him. It is not a statement that teaches that other celestial beings don't exist. It is a statement, the statements that I am and there's none beside me, is a statement that teaches that those celestial beings don't compare to Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel. So Yahweh is an Elohim, but other Elohim are not Yahweh. God is an inhabitant of the celestial world. So they call him by the terms all other celestial beings get. Elohim, or God, and they do it over 2,000 times. But other Elohim are not like Yahweh. There are plenty of qualities that Yahweh alone possesses. Qualities that set the Holy One apart from all other Elohim in the ancient world. And I hope you can read this. It was hard finding a color that showed up well with this background. But I like this background because it does a good job actually making the hierarchy. God, Elohim, singular, way up here, incomparable to all the other celestial beings up here. So Yahweh is uncreated. He did not have to come into being. He has always been, and that is the true essence of what it means for him to be eternal. He is omnipotent, meaning he possesses all power. He is omnipresent. He exists everywhere. He is omniscient. He knows all things. He is infallible and morally perfect. He is unable to cease existing. There's a lot of things God can't do. God can't stop being God. That's one of them. The celestial beings were created by Yahweh, so they had a beginning. They are limited in power because whatever power they get from Yahweh. They are unbound by a single physical form. That's true, but they don't exist everywhere. And the Bible talks a lot about the fact that they don't know everything. They long to understand some things that are not revealed to them. Things that you could have access to and you could understand that even the angelic celestial beings didn't get a chance to experience and understand. They are fallible. They are corruptible. They sin. They rebel. This is all just background information that you need to understand before we get to Genesis 3 when we meet the first rebel, the serpent. And Yahweh can, and if you read Psalm 82 correctly, will destroy them. However that looks and whatever that means. So next time we're going to pick up with this. The story of the Bible is the story of characters who are, and they're supporting characters, okay? A story, you have your cast, your main characters, but all the time they're interacting with the support cast. That's a good way to think about this, and I want you to think about the Bible as a story that you would read like you would read a novel, believing that the author is actually trying to guide you to an understanding and an idea at the end. To do that, you have God and certain humans that make up his main characters, but then you actually have the celestial cast, the supporting cast, and they're usually in the background of the biblical story, and they're just kind of assumed to be there sometimes and not directly talked about. Sometimes they are given direct attention, but then they come and go, having done their job, they go back into the heavenly realm where they belong. So in the Bible, the supporting celestial cast are often referred to as gods, lowercase g gods, plentiful in number. But there is an capital G God who is singular in number. That is Yahweh alone. Does that mean the Bible teaches monotheism, or does it teach polytheism? The answer is it depends on what you mean when you talk about a God. And so often we take our modern definitions, well, there's only one God because there's only one being that's omniscient and omnipresent and, all the omnis. There's only one eternal being that never came into, so there's only one God. Well, then you have to reckon with why the Hebrew Old Testament calls all the other celestial beings gods. Because they didn't define God by these terms that define Yahweh. They just used it at God as a broad term for all non-physical celestial beings in the heavenly realm. They were not as good as God. He's higher in the pecking order for good reason. He is greater than they. He alone is God in a certain sense of the word. And a lot of the times, because you have your own meanings, you read the text with your own meanings. Because they have their own meanings, they're writing about something completely different than you are. And people get this confused. And you will hear from pulpits, as long as you are in churches, misunderstanding about scriptures because they don't understand what a God was in the Bible. What is a God? Any non-physical celestial being. That's it. Does that mean that they are God? No. Does that mean you should worship them? No. Does that mean you should pay much attention to them at all? Probably not. But they do have a role to play. We will start dissecting what that role is come next week. That is the assumptions that we are rolling with.